Hello, I'm Tom Anderson from the University of Sheffield, and I'm here to talk to you about face-to-face lab teaching in an age of pandemic, tragedy, triumph, and the student voice. So, there are two key transitions that we can target here, going from A-level to university or from university to employment, and I'm most interested in the first of these. Now, I've presented a certain amount of work in the past, and I've put a link there to a previous conference if you want to view that in full. To briefly summarise, because I want to talk about new things today, there's a new A-level syllabus introduced a number of years ago, which introduced a 12 experiment minimum, and feedback from students and demonstrators showed that this change to the A-level course led to students with more confidence in a lab environment. They had already done a number of experiments like recrystallization and titration, which were previously presented as though they were new for the first time in our course. So I redesigned the course around this. I redesigned this, to acknowledge the skills the students had. It was important not to treat them as though they didn't have that skill, because then they lose engagement and confidence in the course, as happened to me as an undergraduate, where my course acted as though NMR wasn't at A-level when it already was, for example. And I redesigned it around that, and I took advantage of the greater confidence students had working in a lab environment to design the course being less handholdy, less spoon-feedy, to use vague terms. Again, if you want more details on that, I've provided a link there to previous work, but I want to talk about new material today. In order to inform all this, both before and after making changes, I ran pedagogic research, surveys and focus groups, which I'll be talking about today. I should say in the previous work I mentioned there, as I'll go on, this is before running focus groups. So what I'll be talking about today is largely the findings of the latest surveys and the focus groups. So let's talk about pedagogic research. I conducted some anonymous surveys towards the end of semester 1 of labs, and just to be clear, I actually ran these for 3 years. The first year was just a trial, not done too rigorously, to get an idea of how things should work. In the second year, I did run them rigorously, and I intended to follow up with focus groups. Unfortunately, that second year was 2019-2020, so because of the pandemic coming at just the wrong time, those focus groups ended up being cancelled. However, I did collect data, and that's what I presented in that previous work I just referenced. Today I'm going to be presenting data from the same survey run with this last year's group of students who were taught labs face-to-face in pandemic conditions, as I'll explain, and then the focus groups that were done online, obviously, with those same students or volunteers from them. So here's a question I want to discuss. Are students still scholars? So this is something that came up when I was redesigning the course. We often historically treat those two terms as synonymous, but in fact, if you look at the data, you will find that I did sort of a control group here. Do you enjoy streaming videos, watching television for pleasure? Basically everyone. And do you enjoy reading books for pleasure? And as you can see, over 40% of students disagree or strongly disagree with that statement. And this is important. I've deliberately put this in a non-work context because I think it's relevant. If students are not accustomed to the idea of reading large quantities of text or for a long period, it becomes a problem if our courses are designed around the assumption that they can read large amounts of text for long periods. So let's see what the focus groups had to say about this. So this is quite recent work. So one student said quite tellingly, if you haven't done anything at A-level where you've had to read, such as A-level English, then a lot of people don't touch a book, and the only time they've probably read is at GCSE, is the way they put it there. And a different student says that's devoting an hour or 2 hours to that leisure activity, and that doesn't engage them. In fact, they found that too much of a challenge. Now, that is a significant problem. You could say it's a problem for society, but I'm not going to go there. From our purely higher education perspective, it is certainly a problem because our courses assume that, students can read significant amounts of textbooks or lab manuals before going into the lab. So a common panacea quoted at this point is, just use electronic textbooks, put it online. If it's on a screen, that's better. It's not, because students will also tell you, certainly this group will, I prefer physical copies to ebooks, I hate reading from tablets. This isn't hypothetical. We did give them both electronic and physical textbooks that year, and they preferred the physical ones of the same editions. Another common objection that you'll hear is they just look up tutorial videos on YouTube for things now, therefore you should put everything into videos and go away. But again, that doesn't work either. So I set the question, again, a real life example, would they prefer to use a tutorial video or a text list of instructions? And it varies, students quite sensibly say it varies on context. But a number of students are clearly a bit fed up with the stereotype that they use videos for everything. You can see that first student there absolutely hates it when the only thing that comes up is tutorial videos, feels it's time wasting when you can just move on to the next bit of text. So that's not a solution either. Videos are still useful, but they're not a replacement for textbooks and manuals. What's the best way to communicate information and maintain skills development continuously? Well, I inherited very thick lab manuals, and there's more detail about this in the previous work I quoted. The point is, it's no use having all the answers to the questions they might ask in there if they're never going to open it, because they're a non-habitual reader and they're intimidated by it. And because you couldn't expect the students to drag around the same manual, and an extra manual every semester, you had to repeat safety and skills information every time, so they had it on them. So I decided that wasn't the best way to do it. I've used the word split, but that's not really sensible. These are two completely new manuals I wrote. One with generic skills and instructions that they can go back to in second year or in third year, carry on, and one with just the experiments for doing them the first time in level 1, which they then don't have to look back on unless they need to. That's the philosophy, and it was much more compact. Student feedback here, 95% of students think this is a good idea. Of course, it's a slightly biased question because they don't have a basis for comparison. These students didn't see the old system. I'm glad they like it, and focus groups support that. They say, I think they gave us everything we need to know, which was the point here, not unnecessary detail. But the students don't have a basis for comparison, and that is a significant concern for other things. So, for example, I cut lab assessment considerably between the teal year and the green year, shown here, the first and second year, that were assessed here. And yet the students, their own perception, I carefully didn't ask about hours here, their perception was they were spending about the same amount of time on write-ups. And the orange year, which is the year just gone, the pandemic year, they actually felt they were spending longer, even though in reality they were spending shorter. I do understand that one because it was done in a more stop-starty way, because the way we had to run the lab schedule. However, this just illustrates that just because you think you've improved something doesn't mean it's self-apparent to the students. It's important. Communication and messaging is very important. You'll notice, by the way, these surveys I'm quoting have a response rate of over 70%, and in one case 100%. That's what happens when you do paper surveys in person in the lab rather than expecting students to reply to emails. So again, I will sort of get on my podium about that one. Another example of student-teacher disconnect. Mark Prensky famously said, calling the phrase digital natives. An actual student born the year after that once told me, I've never used a computer before. And again, this is not uncommon. It became very relevant in 2020 when we were expecting students to be able to have all this immediate awareness. And again, 1 in 10 students doesn't agree with this description. A lot of them do, but 1 in 10 rejects it, and in some cases quite vehemently, as you can see in this focus group. Some say, it's a spectrum, very sensibly. It's not something you are or you aren't. And one of the things that is brought up in particular is students are familiar with Word and often PowerPoint, actually. They do presentations at school, but not Excel. Some students will say they've never seen Excel before. They've only seen it because they're doing A-level physics. And this is supported in this survey data here. More than half the students actually say they were completely unfamiliar with Excel before, or they weren't confident with Excel before starting. So this is not something you can assume they just know. It's actually very important for physical chemistry courses. So ironically, because of the new A-levels, they're probably better with things like a recrystallization than knowing you don't do the sums by hand and then type the answers into Excel. And what about student feedback about this? Well, students said they felt the lab course's design takes into account my previous experience. I'm very pleased with these results. I won't talk about them in detail here, but discontent has gone down since I took over, and it stayed pretty consistent even through the pandemic year. Let's talk about the pandemic year. So we have very large labs in the department, which we've always been told waste space, but suddenly they were useful in the pandemic. Could get 18 students in a lab that normally take 55, socially distanced, safe labs going on, full risk assessments and so on. This led to 5 cohorts with a 4-day lab week, which we're a bit concerned about, but the students massively rose to the occasion. They did really well. You can see I've set up a schedule here for the students. 4 experiments, 2 with online write-ups, or just assessments, 2 with full result sheet assessments. Those were them. They had 11 days to write up, and then those were marked. So again, ironically, and the point I want to make here is the new A-levels, the focus on independence and my innovations towards that direction ironically helped in pandemic teaching. Experiments that were designed for use in pairs were now being done individually. You can see here the students actually like that. They love the amount of freedom. The independence was daunting at first, but then they found it to be really good. And I'll just briefly mention these things. I had to come up with online marking, come up with training videos for colleagues who couldn't come to me for help because I wasn't necessarily in the department, manage student expectations, and this 4-day lab week meant we had to come up with some new online exercises, as I was saying. So there was a lot of work that went, not just from me, but technical staff, the students themselves, postgrads, health and safety, but we taught labs the entire lab curriculum. I think we did 80% in the end because of the extra lockdown, but we did 80% of the lab curriculum. The students did it and they will benefit from that in future years. So I'm very proud of that, and I'm glad that this was started by pedagogic research is the point. We can't reduce the student experience to stereotypes. It's all about the pedagogic research informing what their experience actually is. And I've just gone over time, so I will stop there.